Experiential learning. So let's look at some of the criticisms related to experiential learning. Because for all of those positive aspects, and there are a lot of them, and we really like to give a lot of accolades and excitement to experiential learning, but there are certainly a lot of people that support this methodology of learning. But there are also some criticisms or weaknesses. Now, mind you, this is not going to be a comprehensive list, but here are some things that are really interesting and important to pay attention to when we look at experiential learning. So experiential learning is not just a plug and play option. It's going to take time for the student or the learner or anyone to really get used to this experiential process. And this is not too difficult to understand or believe, right? Because we really have been ingrained in a teacher-centered approach or a more passive approach to learning and education. And so therefore we think that we should be able to coast through life and coast through our world in a very passive capacity. So it's necessary to change our mind and heart to really start investigating experiences. It takes effort and it takes desire, and it's going to take a lot of dedication to change our mindset from a passive to a more interactive methodology. Now, this is going to be especially true for those who have been more accustomed to that teacher-centered learning approach. So ponder what it would be like to move away entirely from that lecture approach to a hands-on learning experience. It's going to really be difficult, and it's going to be part of that change and change management. And the same idea applies when we have anyone who's used to the teacher-centered approach that is going to try to really do more hands-on. It really is unnerving and it makes people uneasy. So be paying attention to that. Next, another criticism is that practitioners tend to jump into experiential learning without understanding the barriers, such as attempting to do too much. Think of it like buying a new house and immediately starting a huge project like moving plumbing around, or maybe taking down a wall or electrical information or anything like that, right? Now, when we introduce experiential learning, it's like that new house. So sometimes we want to start a little bit slower. We don't want to jump in and start moving plumbing around, right? We may want to start with something simpler and say, I just want to learn how to change a faucet first. So when you are working with a new learner who's new to experiential learning, start with a smaller project or a smaller learning experience before tackling those larger investigations. And also make sure that you give enough time. So many educators are going to introduce experiential learning, but they're really determined to confine it to just a little class period or maybe part of a class period. But you need to have really open-ended time frames, and they need to be available for that practice, and especially for those new experiential learners. Solitary learning. This is often a mistaken concept of experiential learning, is we tend to think, oh, you know what, solitary learning, experiential learning, it's the same. And especially because we have that reflective component. But this is not the case. Learners need to be encouraged to collaborate with other people. They need to be encouraged to work in groups and also with pairs. So when using experiential learning within a classroom setting, make sure that you set aside time for quiet learning, especially for that introverted solitary learner, but also that more interactive time for that extroverted social learner, and encourage both types of learners to attempt learning in their less preferred methodology. This is going to give them also some opportunity to bridge some gaps between the different learners and to be able to see how other people are going to learn. So don't introduce too much information. So one of the biggest criticisms with experiential learning is that we really tend to introduce way too much information. And this is going to overwhelm, exasperate, and frustrate a new learner. Additionally, there's a really careful balance between the active learning experience and analyzing time and reflection. So be sure that you give substantial amount of time for both activities. Next, we have reluctant learners. So we really want to be sensitive to these reluctant learners and to the learner's needs. So think about this as change management. What we want to see is that when we introduce any kind of new learning, new teaching methodology, new technology, some people are going to jump in and they're going to be super excited about that change. Others are going to be very reluctant. So be sensitive to those needs. Remember that everybody is going to adapt to change at different rates. And a great option is to take some time to really look at change management and investigate and see how you can use and learn about that in order to help your students and help others. For learners who need guidelines, this is really difficult when we talk about experiential learning. So we need to find ways to implement guidelines and look how you can demonstrate timelines and checklists for them, even though this is a more free-flowing type of learning. So be sure to explain that experiential learning is a personalized journey and that individuals can use a less structured approach or a more structured approach like the reflective learning steps or reflective learning guidance. Next, many educators wrongly assume that experiential learning is completely without structure, that it requires no planning, that they can just jump in and it's going to work. And this is wrong. It requires about the same amount of planning, if not more planning, than other traditional methodologies. Planning needs to take place, but avoid over-planning with timelines and restrictions. Experiential learning can be a bit unscripted, but this does not mean that planning should not take place. Simply be flexible. Your learners are also going to be very valuable, so make sure that you include them in this learning process. They really need to be part of that process. So when you use experiential learning, be prepared to let go of your plans and move in a completely different direction. This part of experiential learning is really disconcerting for educators who are used to having objectives, concrete plans, timelines, and rubrics, right? We love to plan. But this lack of clarity and planning, however, does not impede that learning experience. It actually enhances the learning as learners are going to walk up and down unexpected venues that are going to lead to unexpected insights, learning, and even growth. Next, be sure to use that reflective practice. We can't emphasize that enough. That experiential learning needs to have the reflective practice to debrief. Otherwise, the learning event has become nothing more than just another learning activity. The point is to develop deeper learning, which will occur only when there is that debriefing point. There are many options for debriefing when you use experiential learning, so be sure to look and see the ways in which you can implement that. Assessment. This is a huge criticism when it comes to experiential learning. There is really a lack of formal traditional assessment practices when you use experiential learning, and this is very frustrating to educators. So being aware of these criticism downfalls as an educator as you approach experiential learning is really important, so that way you can avoid these pitfalls and problems when you implement them in your own classrooms.